Hello, anatomy. Welcome to our video lecture for chapter 12, the lymphatic system and body defenses. So a couple of things up front that I want to talk about. So I'm a huge fan, especially of the immune system, which is in this chapter. There's lots of things that I like to do in class with the immune system, lots of things I like to cover that aren't in the textbook necessarily. So what I want to do in this video, I want to try and get the entire chapter done in one video, and it's going to be pretty content heavy. And it might appear that we're going through this kind of quickly, which, to be honest, we probably are going through it pretty quickly. But I want to hit I want to get a baseline of the content done in one video up front so we can do some reinforcement stuff in class. Some things on diseases, some things on vaccines. So if it seems like we're going fast, again, we are going to go fast. And if everything doesn't stick in your head after watching this video, just be reassured that we're going to go back and revisit a lot of this stuff in class. So chapter 12, the lymphatic system and body defenses. So if someone asked you just to spit out, all the human organ systems, the lymphatic system probably isn't the one that pops to mind first. It's an incredibly important body system. And, this chapter lumps the immune system in with it, which is totally fair because the two systems work very, very close together. But it's a little ironic that the lymphatic system gets top billing in this chapter when the immune system is the one that people probably think of before they think of the lymphatic system. So what is the lymphatic system? So first off, there are two semi-independent parts. You have what are called lymphatic vessels, which are in a lot of ways similar to veins. And then you have some lymphoid tissues and organs, things like tonsils or your spleen. We're going to go through all these in this video. The functions of the lymphatic system. So as your blood flows through arteries and veins, especially in this case in capillaries, your blood loses blood volume. Your blood loses fluid to what are called your interstitial spaces, which are basically like the spaces between your cells and tissues. And if that fluid never got returned to your circulatory system, you would swell. You'd have what's called an edema, which we'll get to in a minute, which is just a swelling of your interstitial spaces. So your lymphatic system, in part, helps to return lost volume to your circulatory system. And it also plays a crucial role in your immune system, which we're going to see in this chapter. So just some terms. So lymph is what we call the fluid carried by lymphatic vessels. Again, it's the fluid that's lost from your circulatory system. Properties of lymphatic vessels. So they're similar to veins. They only flow toward the heart. There's no pump. Fluid moves through lymphatic vessels, kind of like with veins, due to you moving the movement of your skeletal muscles, what the textbook calls the milking action, and the rhythmic contractions of smooth muscles in vessel walls helps to propel lymphatic fluid back to the heart. The vessels can also change in size. When they get broader, fluid tends to move where there's more volume. So these are some pictures from your book. So here you can see in your blood capillaries, you're losing fluid. Most textbooks show lymphatic vessels as green, just to differentiate them from arteries, which are shown as red, and veins, which are shown as blue. Look, obviously they're not really green, but you can see that you're losing fluid from your capillaries, and these lymphatic vessels are carrying the fluid back to your heart. They actually enter largely in your subclavian veins, which we'll get to in a minute. And you have these sort of swellings called lymph nodes, which I'm sure you've heard of those before. And these lymphatic vessels sort of intermingle with your blood capillaries to help recollect the fluid that's lost from the capillaries throughout your body. So this shows your main, sort of like a map of your lymphatic vessels and lymph nodes. So I don't want to get too bogged down in the details, but you can see you have what's called a right lymphatic duct and a left lymphatic duct, which is over here. And you can see they enter into the right and left subclavian veins, which is sort of, around your collarbone. And they return the fluid into those veins. And obviously it's going to wind up, in this case, in the superior vena cava, which will take, you know, in that case, that's the blood going back to your right atrium. You can see in this picture where you have lots of lymph nodes, largely in your neck, in your armpit, in your groin area. You've probably been to the doctor and, you know, had the, you know, you feel bad. The doctor feels your neck. He says your glands are swollen. They're not really glands. That's a misnomer. They're lymph nodes. And it's interesting if we'll get to this in a minute, but if your lymph nodes are swollen, so your lymph nodes house immune system cells. So if you're sick and your, you know, immune system is in hyperdrive, those lymph nodes actually do swell. So that's an indication that you're fighting off an infection if your lymph nodes are swollen. You know, if you are not feeling well and you go to the doctor, say you don't feel well because you have an allergy, it's like hay fever, that is unlikely to cause your lymph nodes to swell because that's not fighting an infection. So if the doctor feels your lymph nodes are swollen, it probably is because you have some kind of usually virus or bacteria. Okay, so lymph, like I said, things that are harmful, bacteria, viruses, cancer cells, debris from cells can enter into lymphatic vessels, and then obviously would find their way into lymph nodes. Lymph nodes are, I mean, they're crucial to return that fluid back to your circulatory system, but they're also a little bit dangerous because take cancer, for example. Once something gets into a lymph node, which isn't terribly hard to do, it can go anywhere in your body. So oftentimes, if someone has cancer and they have a tumor removed, the doctor will also remove the lymph nodes around the tumor. And then a pathologist will check out the lymph nodes. And if there's cancer in the lymph nodes, they'll probably go back in and take out more. If your lymph nodes are clear of cancerous cells, it means they likely got it all. But again, if one cancer cell from a tumor gets into a lymph node, the cancer can spread very easily. The lymph nodes, again, you can see from this slide, they filter lymph before it's returned to the blood. So this is where this kind of mingles with the immune system. So a lot of these white blood cells, a lot of these immune system cells, we first met in chapter 10 when we did the chapter on the blood. Things like white blood cells, lymphocytes. We mentioned these before. We're gonna visit them again. So macrophages are a type of white blood cell that can engulf and destroy foreign substances. Macrophages, again, we're going to see them again later in this chapter, are a crucial component of your immune system. And again, they're white blood cells that can be found inside your lymphatic vessels and lymph nodes themselves. Lymphocytes, we saw this back in chapter 10 as well. Lymphocytes are cells like B cells and T cells that are also very important in providing an immune response to antigens. We're going to, again, meet them again here in just a minute. Other lymphoid organs. So you kind of have like a splattering of lymphatic organs throughout your body. So your spleen, we'll go through each of these in a minute. Your spleen, which is right here. Your thymus gland, which is under your sternum, sort of like the base of your throat, sort of. Your tonsils, the back of your throat, and what are called Peyer's patches, which are throughout your intestines. So we're just going to hit these briefly. Your spleen, left side of your abdomen, again, it's right here. It filters blood. It filters out especially dead and dying red blood cells to, like, you know, recycle the iron so your body isn't wasting it. It also acts as a reservoir of blood. If you are losing blood, if you're bleeding, your spleen will contract to get more blood into your system. In a fetus, it actually forms red blood cells. And you can live without a spleen. If you have a cancer or whatever, if for whatever reason your spleen becomes enlarged, it could burst, and the doctor will remove it, and you can live without a spleen. Your thymus gland's located below in your throat. We met the thymus gland in chapter 9, the endocrine system. I think it was chapter 9. It produces hormones like thymosin, which are ones that are important to stimulate, in that case, T cells in your immune system. And it functions mostly when you're a kid. So your tonsils are lymphoid tissue in your throat, the back of your throat. They serve to trap and remove bacteria, other foreign materials. Because of that, they can easily become infected and enlarged and swollen, which can lead to problems, of course. A lot of people can have tonsils or sometimes what are called your adenoids in the back of your throat. We're going to see the adenoids later in class. Obviously, you can live without your tonsils. Peyer's patches are little patches of lymphatic tissue found in your small intestine. They look a lot like tonsils. It's kind of eerie how much they look like tonsils, because they kind of are tonsils, and they'll capture and destroy bacteria from your intestines. Okay, so that's really all that I want to say in this video about the lymphatic system. In class, we'll discuss some more things about it and go over what we just did again. Now I want to transition to the immune system, which obviously is a very important body system, even though, again, it doesn't get top billing in this chapter. And I like to spend lots of time on the immune system in class. It's a system that a lot of times gets skipped in school in favor of maybe body systems that are more well known, but I think it's a tragedy to skip the immune system because it's a really important system. Okay, so there's a lot to say. So you're constantly being exposed to bacteria, fungi, viruses, things that are invaders, things that can potentially make you sick. So we like to subdivide things into categories. That's what we do as scientists, as people, just to understand it. We subdivide your immune system into two main systems, what's called the innate or nonspecific defense system, and the adaptive or the specific defense system. That's great. Just keep in mind, you have one big happy immune system, and both parts like interact with each other all the time. We subdivide these just to help us learn it, but it's not like they're completely separate systems. So your innate defense system, it's not specific to like a certain kind of bacteria or virus. They're non-specific defenses to protect you from viruses, like your skin. Your skin, for instance, is part of your innate defense system. And we're going to go through this more, obviously, here in a minute. The adaptive immune system, or the specific immune system, this gets into T cells and B cells and antibodies. This is the system that targets specific invaders. If you get the flu and you feel bad for a week or so, and then your body eventually fights off that flu, that was your adaptive or specific immune system targeting one single antigen. Obviously, your body does both. And the word immunity, again, is just a specific resistance to a disease. Typically, once you fight off a disease, you're immune to it, for decades or your whole life, potentially. As you get older, your immune system does tend to get dialed down a little bit. So this is a table from the book, just to review, and this is what the rest of the chapter is about. So your innate non-specific defense mechanisms, there's what's called a first line and a second line. The first line is your skin, your mucous membranes, like in your nose, your throat, and the secretions of those mucous membranes, things like mucus. It's very effective at keeping things out, but it's not specific to a certain kind of invader. The second line largely involves cellular things or protein components, phagocytic cells, natural killer cells, we'll see these in a minute, antimicrobial proteins like interferon, and the inflammatory response, which we saw that back in chapter 10 with basophils and histamine. They're not specific to one kind of invader, but they do involve cells or proteins. And then the third line is the adaptive, which involve T cells and B cells, antibodies, things that target specific invaders. And again, we're going to go through all three of these in this video. Okay, so for the first line, there isn't that much to say about it. So they're mechanical barriers, things like your skin, things like your mucous membranes, specialized kinds of human cells. The fact that your sweat can be slightly acidic, which helps kill bacteria. Tears have antibacterial properties to them as well. They're the first line of defense. They're like the walls of a castle, I suppose. And they're pretty effective most of the time, but they don't target things specifically. So the second line of defense, moving ahead, we already mentioned these: natural killer cells, the inflammatory response, phagocytes, and antimicrobial proteins in fever. These are things, they're still non-specific. They don't target specific invaders, but these are things that kick in once an invader has actually entered your body. And let's go through each of these briefly. So natural killer cells, these are a type of lymphocyte, kind of like T cells and B cells. They are cells, the name gives it away, they're natural killers. They can target invaders, and they can target your own cells that have been infected. They can kill your own cells, which is, useful, I suppose, because it keeps the infection from spreading. They'll release a chemical called perforin, which causes cell membranes to disintegrate and nuclear membranes to disintegrate, which kills them. And they'll do this to your own cells. They're pretty rough. They don't suffer fools. So the inflammatory response, we talked about this back in chapter 10, I believe, the chapter on blood. So this is a series of responses that are a reaction to like you being cut or you being injured or things like a rash. The four most common effects are redness, heat, swelling, and pain. And we're going to go through where this comes from in a minute. And again, these are things that result from some kind of injury. And they do promote healing, although they might make you feel bad in the short term. And if you remember back in chapter 10, I mentioned this earlier. Histamine is a chemical that causes blood cells to dilate. So it increases the blood flow to a region, which could happen if you have a cut, or it could be part of an allergic reaction. So the inflammatory response, again, this is from your book. So let's just go through this briefly. So this person cut their finger on a piece of glass. Man, I bet that hurt. So you have a cut, cells are damaged. So the cells around it will release chemicals called kinins, which we'll see in a minute, histamine, we saw in chapter 10, and other chemicals that can do three main things. They make your blood vessels dilate. They cause your capillaries to become leaky, and they will recruit neutrophils, remember, which was a kind of white blood cell back in from chapter 10, and then monocytes to enter the area. So when your blood cells dilate, that increases the blood flow to the region, which is good because your immune system is largely in your blood, right? But that can also lead to swelling or to redness. It can make the region hot, like if it's a rash, say. It will increase the metabolic rate of those tissues, which promotes healing. Capillaries that become leaky, that's good because certain kinds of white blood cells can actually leave your capillaries and go into the tissues to do their job, which is good. The problem, though, is that can lead to an edema, which is a swelling. If that fluid leaves, this is the whole point of the immune system. Swelling is one symptom. Swelling can cause pain. If it's happening in a joint, it can cause achy joints and can make you stiff. But that also promotes healing. Clotting factors like platelets also will come more to that region, which if it's a cut, you want the blood to clot. That promotes healing. And finally, neutrophils and later monocytes can target invaders, kill them, and then sweep all the damaged stuff away and heal you. So all of these parts of the inflammatory response, that might make you feel bad, but the whole end point here is to heal the wound. And again, this would be the second line of defense, because at this point, something has entered your body, but this isn't a specific immune response. Okay, so we said this back in chapter 10. So neutrophils were those very, very, very common types of white blood cells. If you remember back in chapter 10, diapedesis was this idea that neutrophils can actually squeeze through capillary walls and get into your tissues. That's called positive chemotaxis because they go toward a foreign invader and they'll handle it. They'll neutralize it. Here you can see a picture of that. This person's stepped on a nail or something that looks awful. And these neutrophils that kind of roll along blood vessels, and they'll actually leave the blood vessels, especially if the blood vessels are dilated, and they'll go handle. So this was a nail that had some kind of bacteria on it. This is a picture of an actual macrophage. Macrophages are sort of like monocytes. Remember we did monocytes back in chapter 10. They're kind of a form of monocyte, and they will use their cytoplasmic extensions. In this case, they're pulling spherical bacteria and engulfing it, and then, you know, basically digesting it and spitting out the residue. Macrophages are good at targeting foreign bacteria and viruses. Other parts of the second line, so interferon. Interferon is a series of proteins that are secreted by your cells that are infected, in this case with the virus. So it's like waving the white flag, saying, I surrender. Actually, it's more than that. They're saying, I surrender, and someone come kill me because I'm one of you, but I've been infected. So kill me now, or I'm going to release viruses and make the infection worse. And these are chemical or proteins that help slow down viral replication. Fever, remember your hypothalamus was your body's thermostat. So fever, like when you get sick and you have a fever, the sickness doesn't cause the fever. You cause the fever. The fever is part of your immune response to an infection. In fever, it's debated how effective fever really is at fighting an infection. These chemicals called pyrogens, which are given off by white blood cells, are what cause a fever. You know, high temperatures can inhibit the release of iron and zinc, which bacteria need, which could slow them down. Fever does increase your metabolism, so it can increase tissue repair, but fever really isn't that great of a anti-pathogen response to disease, to be honest. You know, if you're sick, you take Advil or Tylenol to bring down the fever because you feel bad. And a too high a fever obviously can be very, very bad. It can cause seizures and such. Okay, so that was the first line. The second line, the third line is going to get most of our attention. So the third line would be your specific immune response to a specific pathogen, like, say, COVID-19, which we'll discuss here in a minute. So immunology is just a study of immunity. It's a fascinating science. If you major in biology in college or grad school or whatever, immunology, it's so complicated. Like the more you know, the more you realize that you don't know, but it's really, really, really cool. So antibodies, so your lymphocytes, B cells in this case, produce proteins called antibodies. Antibodies are good. Antibodies, where they come from, we'll see here in a minute. Antibodies protect you from disease, from pathogens. The word pathogen just means something that makes you sick, like a virus or a bacteria or a fungus or whatever. Three aspects of the adaptive, the third line of defense. So antigen specific. So antigens are things that your body recognizes that are foreign. So the flu, strep throat, COVID-19, all these things, these are antigens. Antigens are foreign. Antigens are bad, usually. You make antibodies to target antigens. Kids get these words confused. Antigens, foreign, bad. Antibodies, you make them, they're good. And again, antigens are specific structures that you become immune to. Systemic, because antibodies can go throughout your entire body, through your blood. And memory, because once you have encountered an antigen, and assuming that you've successfully fought it off, you remember it. And if you're exposed to it again, you fight it off much, much faster the second time, which we'll get to here. So types of immunity, humoral versus cellular immunity. Again, we classify things because that's what scientists do to help us learn them, but both these parts work together, and the names are a little bit misleading. So your body humors are the fluids of your body, like your blood, like lymphatic fluid. When the humoral immune system was named, so the humoral system is based upon antibodies, which we just saw in the previous slide. Antibodies travel through your body's fluids. So it was named humoral because it's carried by your body's fluid, all right? The cellular immunity is based upon cells, like T cells. The T cells also travel through your body's humors. So the names are a little bit misleading because it all goes through your blood and lymphatic fluids. Humoral, just think this, humoral relies upon antibodies. made by B cells, which we'll see in a minute. The cellular immunity relies upon the action of cells like T cells, which we'll see in a minute, to target your own cells that are infected, your own cells that are cancerous. If you get an organ donation or like a skin graft, if it's not a match, which what that means, we'll see in a minute, your body will reject it, because if it's foreign, it's an antigen, and your body will fight those off. So humoral, antibodies, cellular, cells. So again, the word antigen just means anything that's non-self, anything that should not be in your body because it's not natural, or it's not, that's not a good term, not natural. It's not something that your body produces. So things that can elicit an immune response. So the flu, COVID-19, strep throat, pollen, a vaccine, examples, foreign proteins. Your body responds to foreign proteins pretty dramatically because those should not be there. But also nucleic acids, large carbohydrates, some lipids, pollen grains, microorganisms like bacteria. These are all antigens. They're non-self that your body responds to. Self-antigens, so, is that a misnomer, self-antigen? Well, your body is able to recognize what's called self from non-self. So like if you have type A blood, you have the A antigen on your blood cells. We did this in chapter 10. The A antigen is not foreign if that's what you have. So your body knows not to attack your blood cells because it can actually recognize self-antigens, which are what cell surface features your body has naturally. And normally, unless you have an autoimmune disease, your immune system does not attack your own cells. If I give you a blood transfusion that doesn't match, or a donation, say a kidney donation from someone that has different antigens, your body will reject it because your immune system sees that as foreign, all right? Cells of the adaptive defense system. So we briefly touched on this in chapter 10. Lymphocytes, there's two main kinds. There are what are called B lymphocytes, which we'll see in a minute, and there are what are called T lymphocytes, B cells and T cells. Macrophages are another kind of white blood cell, which we saw them earlier in this video. These are cells that help out lymphocytes. We'll see how in just a second. The word immunocompetent. So let me actually pause for just a second. I just wanted to see what was, I know somewhere in here I added a thing about COVID. I just couldn't remember where I put it. Okay, so immunocompetent. So T cells and B cells, they're not born specific, right? Well, actually, that's not true. T cells and B cells become activated when they've actually bound to the antigen that they're designed to attack, all right? So say you have COVID-19, you will have T cells and B cells that become activated because they see COVID-19. And when they're activated, they go to town and they multiply through what's called clonal selection, and they increase rapidly in number to elicit a huge immune response to COVID-19 or the flu or whatever the disease is. Lymphocytes, so ones that originate in your bone marrow are called B cells, B lymphocytes. The B is for bone marrow. And the ones that originate in your thymus gland in your chest are called T cells. So B stands for bone marrow, T stands for thymus. This is all part, again, of the third line of defense, the specific immune response. Macrophages, we saw a couple times actually already in this video. Macrophages come from monocytes, which are, again, a white blood cell we discussed in chapter 10. They distribute widely throughout your lymphatic organs. They secrete hormones called cytokines. You might have heard, especially in the era of COVID-19, the term cytokine storm. A cytokine storm is when your immune system goes crazy. Oftentimes it's like an overreaction where you get a huge immune response, and that can be bad if that's happening in your blood capillaries, or say in the alveoli of your lungs, which I know we haven't done the lungs yet, but those are the air sacs where air gets exchanged. If you have a cytokine storm in your lungs, that can damage them. And those very thin membranes can become damaged beyond repair. And actually that can potentially kill you. A cytokine storm is generally not something you want to have happen. But yeah, these monocytes or these macrophages secrete cytokines, which stimulate your immune system. And macrophages, again, they tend to remain fixed in your lymphatic tissues themselves. Okay, so I know we're going through a lot of detail here. Again, we're going to revisit some of this stuff in class. So let's just hit the highlights. So let's just pick a virus. Let's just pick COVID-19 because that's what we've been talking about a lot the last year or so. So you know what? Let me actually show a picture. So COVID-19 is a virus, coronavirus, that has these proteins called, we nicknamed them spike proteins. You probably heard about the spike protein a lot lately. So you have a receptor that's very common in your cells called the ACE2 receptor. It's in your respiratory system, it's in your digestive system, it's in your heart. The ACE2 receptor is a very, very important receptor that does lots of things for your body that you have, it's yours. You want ACE2. Well, the spike protein of COVID-19 binds to the ACE2 receptor. It's a very, very tricky virus. And when it binds to the ACE2 receptor, long story short, it's able to infect the cells that it binds to easily. If I could like cleave off the spike protein, COVID wouldn't be able to enter your cells very effectively and it wouldn't be very contagious. But because COVID binds to the spike protein easily, and different variants bind to it stronger than others, it can enter your cells very easily and it's very contagious. So the spike protein, this little red thing, is a protein on the surface of COVID-19 and it's an antigen. The spike protein is not something that your body knows, so it's foreign. So let's go through what would happen if you were infected with COVID-19. So you have B cells. B lymphocytes come from your bone marrow. B lymphocytes have receptors on them. In this case, they're not the ACE2 receptor, but they bind to antigens like the spike protein. And you know, B cells can bind to a huge variety of different kinds of receptors. They're very, very adaptive. And once a B cell, if a B cell sees COVID-19 and it sees the spike protein, it binds to it and it triggers what's called clonal selection, which basically means that B cell is going to become a billion well, not a billion, thousands, millions of B cells very, very quickly. It makes clones of itself. And that's called the primary humoral response, because it's the first time that you've seen it. Okay, so COVID has the spike protein. B cells have receptors that bind to the spike protein, and once they bind, that B cell divides rapidly to make a bunch of B cells really, really fast. So COVID can replicate really, really fast, very contagious, and it's going to replicate quickly. But once your B cells see it, then the B cells can also replicate very, very quickly, and given enough time, unless you have other issues, you're probably going to, recover from it without too much trouble. So again, the primary immune response was the first time you see it. Most B cells become what are called plasma cells. And plasma cells are cells that make antibodies. And where antibodies come from, I'll show you in a minute. Remember when we said B cells, I told you to think antibodies. And they last 4 to 5 days, whatever, and then they're done. However, a small number of B cells become what are called memory cells, and this is your secondary humoral response. Memory cells just hang out for the next couple decades or however long they last, and it's like a memory that they were once soldiers in a war, and if you see COVID-19 or the antigen a second time, their memory triggers really fast and they divide even faster than the first time. And you fight off that disease so quickly that you don't even realize you had it in most cases. Once you're immune to say chickenpox, When I was a kid, I got chickenpox. You probably got the chickenpox vaccine. But once you're immune to chickenpox, and chickenpox sucked, it was a horrible week of my life. I think I was in like, gosh, I don't know, second grade maybe. I don't remember. But it was very, very itchy. It was just bad. It's very contagious. But you're immune to it for decades. Shingles is the same virus that causes chickenpox, but if you get it again, because your immune system has forgotten, because your memory cells are no longer around, and again, you're immune for decades. Usually people suggest you get a second chickenpox vaccine or the shingles vaccine when you're like, I don't know, 50s or 60s, because at that point, your immune system kind of wears down. And shingles is a much, much, much more painful, more dangerous disease than chickenpox. Chickenpox is annoying, but no one dies from chickenpox. Shingles can cause like nerve damage and such. So this is from your book. So the little orange dots, so that's an antigen. This, like in my example, I used the spike protein for COVID-19. Now that would be attached to the virus. Here it just shows antigens that are just like floating around. So if you look in this picture, I have B cells with green receptors, dark blue receptors, and light blue receptors. You have lots of different kinds of B cells. The antigen only binds to the darker blue ones. Because again, this is, things have shape and form. They bind because they touch each other and they actually they bind. So if the dark blue ones are the ones that fit the antigen, you go through clonal selection, you make lots of the dark blue ones. And then you have these plasma cells that, like, look what's happening here. They're the receptors that bound to the antigen, they're just releasing them, right? Plot twist, they can just release the antigen, they can release the receptors, and those are called antibodies. So antibodies are the exact same thing, for the most part, as the antigen receptors, but they're free floating in your blood, and they'll still bind to the antigen, and they'll bind and they'll clump. And it's basically how your body targets them. And when they bind to, say, COVID, it slows it down, because if someone you're bound to it, it can't get into cells. And it's also a way of targeting invaders for another kind of cell to come take care of it. Okay. So all this began with the antigen bound to the dark blue one receptors. They proliferated, they gave off antibodies. Now, 4 or 5 days, you're done. The memory cells hang around. So if you see it a second time, a subsequent exposure, you make plasma cells way faster and you don't even really get sick. Yeah, so this is the same image. So the secondary humoral response, because you have the memory cells, they live a long time, you get a rapid response. This is a sort of a famous immune system graph. So let's say this is chickenpox. So the x-axis is time, the y-axis is how many antibodies you have. If you have antibodies, it's because you're having an immune response. If you have the COVID antibody test, if you have antibodies in your blood from COVID, it's because you were exposed to COVID. Maybe you never even got sick. But if you have COVID antibodies, guess what? You had COVID. So I inject you with, let's say it's chickenpox. I mean, that would be kind of mean, but let's say you're exposed to it. It takes a week or two to get the primary immune response. And then, the antibodies go down because you get better. You see it again around week 4.5 or 5, you get antibodies, it spikes really, really fast, such that you really don't get sick at all. So this is the idea of immunological memory. So active immunity is what you call it when you encounter stuff and fight it off, when you become immune to it because you made antibodies, you made B cells and such. It can be, again, naturally because you saw strep throat and you fought it off, or it could be artificial if you were exposed to a vaccine. So the COVID vaccines, there's several different types of COVID vaccine. Well, there's vaccines for lots of things, right? If I made a vaccine for COVID, if I like exposed you to just the spike protein, like I just gave you spike proteins, would you have an immune response? Absolutely, because your B cells will target the spike protein. Would you get sick? Like, would you get COVID? No, you wouldn't, because you don't have the actual virus. So vaccines, and we're going to discuss vaccines more in class, are a way of tricking your immune system and becoming immune to something without actually seeing the actual virus or bacteria. You might be seeing a part of, it's called an epitope. You might be just seeing the spike protein and becoming immune to that. You know, you could have vaccines could give you a side effect. You could feel sick for a couple hours or a day or so. You could get like flu-like symptoms from the flu vaccine, but that's not because it's the flu. It's because you're having an immune response to the vaccine, which means it's working. Passive immunity is if you have an immunity, like when a mom breastfeeds a baby, antibodies can go from her to the baby. So that's a way of conferring a natural immunity to the baby, but the baby wasn't exposed to the pathogen. And the immunity would wear off. Like the antibodies don't last forever, right? If the mom stops breastfeeding. I can also give you this idea of gamma globulin. I can give you, you've probably heard with COVID, where they have tried taking, it's called convalescent plasma, like the plasma, blood plasma from someone who had COVID and fought it off, because they'll have antibodies in their blood, right? And giving you, if you're the patient, their blood plasma in hopes that those antibodies will help you. And that's been done. It's debatable how effective it actually is. It's been done with COVID. I know it's been done with Ebola too. Like when those patients get better, is it because you gave them the blood plasma, or is it because they fought it off themselves? It's debatable if it actually works that well, but you know, we try it. But basically you're borrowing somebody's antibodies for a short-term response, which could be very helpful, but you don't have immunological memory because you don't have the B cells to make the antibodies. You just have the antibodies themselves. So that's passive immunity, because you get antibodies, but you don't have the memory cells. So antibodies themselves, which are immunoglobulins or this IgS. So again, this is when the B cells give off their receptors. They're soluble proteins because they're flowing through your blood. They're carried in your blood. And again, they're specific. They're kind of these like T or Y-shaped things. They're specific to, say, the spike protein. Okay, so that was half of the third line of defense. That was the humoral or the B cell line. Again, that was a lot, but just remember, B cells or humoral immunity relies upon antibodies. So the cell-mediated immune response. So where to even start? So remember we discussed macrophages, which are like a form of monocyte. So once a T cell becomes immunocompetent, so macrophages can do this thing where they can, say, engulf COVID-19. This is actually kind of cool. Say you have a macrophage. Do I have a picture of this? Yeah, I have a picture here. Let me do this slide first, though. Say you have a macrophage that engulfs COVID-19 and kills it. It eats it up. It destroys it. That's great. You killed one COVID-19. Congratulations. Macrophages will do a thing where they'll take like the spike protein and they'll display it on their cell surface. It's almost like displaying a trophy, saying, here's the spike protein. I killed COVID. The spike protein, I'm keeping this as a trophy and I'm showing it to you because if you bind to this T cell or B cell, you need to be turned on. You need to be activated. And that's how T cells become immunocompetent. That's one way, at least, because they've been presented with an antigen by a macrophage. After a T cell binds with that, and this can happen with B cells too, those cells proliferate as if they were exposed to the actual virus themselves. So let's look at this diagram. I feel that I'm not saying this very well. So here I have what's called a dendritic cell. Say it's a macrophage. This is COVID. It engulfed it. There's a spike protein. It presents it, like it literally presents it on its cell membrane to what's called a helper T cell. Okay, helper T cells give off cytokines, and they do what the name says, they help. They will stimulate the growth of B cells and of what are called cytotoxic T cells. B cells, again, make antibodies. We just did that. T cells are Cytotoxic T cells or killer T cells are ones that do the cell-mediated immune system where they'll actually directly attack infected cells. And, you know, they can work on their own, but when a helper T cell stimulates them, it like enhances the immune response. Later, when we talk, I think we'll talk about HIV, the virus that causes AIDS later, but AIDS infects helper T cells. And if all your helper T cells are wiped out, your immune response plummets because helper T cells are a critical part. Okay, so all this began when a macrophage presented the spike protein, in the case of COVID, to a helper T cell, which gave off cytokines that stimulate B cells, other kinds of T cells, and honestly itself. Yeah, okay. So again, T cells, the ones that are called cytotoxic, can infect or can kill infected cells. They can do the whole thing with perforin where they cause the cell to disintegrate. And helper T cells recruit other T cells or B cells to fight off invaders. Okay. This shows what a cytotoxic T cell does. Here it's targeting, say this is a bacteria, it kind of sticks to it and it gives off perforin, which gets into the bacteria and causes the cellular components to degrade. It kills it, and then it can detach and go kill another one. Like they're ruthless. They're called killer cells for a reason. You also have what are called regulatory T cells. So once you activate T cells and B cells, okay, yes, but at some point you want to stop them. Like they can definitely go too far. And regulatory T cells are ones that release chemicals that suppress B cells and T cells so that your immune system doesn't like go too far. It's almost like negative feedback. So this is a diagram from your book. This looks really complicated, but this summarizes what we just spent the last little bit talking about. So the green is the humoral, or the antibody-based B cell half. This mustard color is the cell-mediated half. So these are B cells, these are T cells. So let's just go through this. Just listen like it's story time for a minute. So you're exposed to an antigen. Let's not use COVID this time. Let's use something else. Let's say that you are exposed to, I don't know, something that's not going to kill you. So let's just say, I don't know, let's just say strep throat. Strep throat can eventually become dangerous, but usually you'll fight it all fine. So you're exposed to, you know what, let's do the flu. Let's just do the flu. I prefer viruses. So you're exposed to a virus. A macrophage came and engulfed it. That's what macrophages do. That macrophage became an antigen presenting cell, which showed a piece of the flu virus to a helper T cell, right? Those helper T cells go right to work. They stimulate B cells and they stimulate cytotoxic T cells. Remember I said a minute ago, if you have AIDS or the HIV virus, you take out this whole part because the AIDS virus infects helper T cells, which limits your immune system. You know, if you have AIDS, you can die of pneumonia or the flu, or I mean, a cold could be deadly. Now, while that's going on, the antigen itself can directly activate B cells, which, remember, B cells, again, make plasma cells that give off antibodies. Some of them stay around to become memory B cells. So if you get a second exposure, we've said this. Antigens can also be displayed by infected cells to stimulate the cytotoxic T cells directly. Remember, those are the ones that give rise to active cytotoxic T cells, which will go kill bacteria, viruses, fungi, parasites, whatever. They also give rise to some memory T cells. So if you have a second exposure, you know, same deal. You also form memory T cells, which in the case of a second exposure also stimulate memory B cells. You get the idea. All these parts work together, right? And each part is important, all right? And the idea here is you can go from, you know, having never seen the antigen before, say it's a novel coronavirus, to seeing it. And, you know, you might get sick, you might feel bad. I mean, you might get very, very sick. COVID can actually, you know, obviously it can kill you. But for most people, give your immune system a little bit of time. Once all this gets activated, you're going to mount a very, very powerful immune response, and you're probably going to fight it off and end up being just fine. Okay. Okay. A couple other things just to hit real quick. So types of tissue grafts, autografts are if you have a burn and I move skin from one part of your body to another, obviously that would not be rejected because that's your own tissues. Isografts, when it comes from an identical twin. Allografts, or when it's taken from an unrelated person, you want it to have some level of matching. A xenograft is one taken from a different species. Autografts and isografts are the best because you won't reject them. Allografts you might reject. You get what's called a match, so that your cell surface antigens are like the person who's giving you the donor kidney or whatever. But even in that case, if you have a kidney transplant, they might give you drugs to suppress your immune system so you don't reject it. Of course, if you're on drugs to suppress your immune system and you get the cold or a flu, that's going to be very, very serious. So usually you're like in isolation, like the hospital. Disorders of the immune system. So these would be some kind of abnormal immune response. So allergies are a kind of hypersensitivity. So like pollen doesn't make you sick. Your body has no reason to respond to pollen. But pollen causes those mast cells to release histamine, which causes the inflammatory response. It can get very serious, like in the case of an anaphylactic shock, like people that have allergies to, say, peanuts. That can be when the response is so powerful that like you're breathing, your airways swell and they get closed off, which obviously you can die from that. You would have like you'd have an EpiPen or something to help counter the inflammatory response. This just shows, so you have an allergen, say it's pollen, the plasma cells, you give off the antibodies, which make histamine give off, or make these mast cells give off the granules, which are histamine. You get more of it. Histamine causes the blood vessels to dilate. So you get more fluid, it gets inflamed, it can get swollen, you can release mucus. You know what it's like when you have had allergies. If it gets really bad, you can constrict your airways and your lungs, which obviously could be fatal in some cases. Autoimmune disorders. So your body doesn't attack your own cells, right? We've discussed cell from non-cell. Well, sometimes it does. Sometimes your body will have an immune system that goes a little haywire and it will attack your own tissues. Multiple sclerosis is a disorder where your immune system attacks nervous tissue of your brain and your spinal cord. Again, these are called autoimmune disorders because it's your body attacking itself. Myasthenia gravis is a condition where your body attacks like the connections between nerves and skeletal muscles. Eventually, like your muscles sort of atrophy. It's a muscular condition. Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disorder where your body attacks your pancreatic cells, which are the ones that produce insulin. Type 2 diabetes is the one that's you're probably more familiar with, which, that can be triggered by poor diet, by obesity, things like that. Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disorder. Both involve insulin, of course. Other examples, rheumatoid arthritis is when your immune system targets the cartilage of your joints, which can be very, very painful. Lupus is a kind of disorder that can affect your kidney, your heart, your lungs, your skin. It's more like a syndrome. Glomerulonephritis is an autoimmune disorder of your kidney. We haven't done your kidney yet, but it's a condition where your body attacks your kidney. All right, last thing. Let's wrap this chapter up. This has been a beast. So it's just some developmental aspects. So your thymus and your spleen develop in the fetal stage. Otherwise, most lymphatic organs aren't that well developed before you're born. Excuse me, newborn babies really don't have much of an immune system at all, which is why a mom breastfeeding is very helpful because she'll transfer some of her antibodies to the baby. And the last point here, I mentioned at the beginning, like when you have cancer, you might have lymph nodes removed to stop the cancer from spreading, which is fine. But if you remove lymph nodes, then you're going to get swelling in that region. If you say, if I remove lymph nodes in my armpit, your arm is going to swell with fluid because those interstitial fluids can't get back into your circulatory system, right? So a result of removing lymph nodes is it causes edema or swelling in the parts of your body where you had the lymph nodes removed. Okay, that was a beast. That was a sprint and a marathon, but we are done there. Hope that was helpful, and I will see you guys next time.